Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. Thank you, my friend in the audience. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum on Alleviating the Housing Crisis in Los Angeles, which, in my opinion, is the most dire and important issue facing Los Angeles today. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current political and social issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of the Rosenblum family. Tonight is the third of a four-part series on the housing crisis in LA. For this iteration, we're going to focus on where's the money? Because in 2016, LA voters voted in a bond measure designed to generate more than $1 billion over 10 years to create affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness. 7 years later, where's the housing? And where's the money? We're also going to talk about building and development. What are the barriers to building more housing in LA? Is it strict building codes? Is it NIMBYism? Is it the high cost of building? Is it corruption? Why is it so hard to get stuff built? And if money and everything else were no object, is it even possible to build our way out of the housing crisis with around 75,000 people currently unhoused and an estimated population increase of 1.5 million new LA residents coming in over the next 20 to 50 years? Tonight we have the voices of 5 experts who will talk to us about these issues in detail. Before I introduce them, I want to invite you to our other upcoming program on the housing crisis on August 22nd, where we'll dedicate the whole evening to talking about what actually works. What are the answers to the ongoing housing crisis, and how do we solve it? We'll be joined by Dr. Margot Kuschel, Director of the UC San Francisco Center for Vulnerable Populations and the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative, to talk about policies that work and blue sky solutions. I also encourage you to watch or listen to the first and second night of this series, in which we attempted to give a kind of overall primer to the giant topic of the housing crisis, and we tried to identify and answer the most common questions and misconceptions about the unhoused, while drilling down to the roots of the current housing crisis in Southern California. They're both available on the Hammer website, and I highly recommend checking them out. So now to introduce our 5 experts. First, you'll hear from Travis Stanley, a veteran who experienced homelessness until recently. And then I'll bring up Anna Scott, a veteran journalist who's focused on housing and homelessness for over 10 years. She's a reporter for public radio station KCRW, and she also reports regularly on homelessness for NPR's national programs. She created and hosted KCRW's podcasts City of Tents, Veterans Row, and Samaritans. Before that, she produced the news programs Press Play, To the Point, and Which Way LA, and wrote for Bloomberg Businessweek, the LA Times, and other local publications. So Anna will moderate a discussion with Dr. Heidi Behforouz of the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, Stephanie Klasky-Gamer of LA Family Housing, and Miguel A. Santana, former City Administrative Officer for the City of Los Angeles. Dr. Heidi Behforouz has focused her career on the health issues of vulnerable populations. She's currently the Medical Director of Housing for Health at the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, which is the second largest safety net provider in the United States, where she oversees LA County's clinical initiatives to improve the health and wellness of the largest homeless population in the country. She's a board-certified internist who trained at Harvard Medical School, and she's received multiple research grants from the National Institutes of Health and used this funding to study the impact of community-based, complex care interventions in improving the health and well-being of vulnerable individuals in urban settings. Stephanie Klasky-Gamer leads LA Family Housing with nearly 30 years of experience in social and economic justice work and an in-depth knowledge of housing policy, finance, and development. Stephanie oversees LA Family Housing's real estate development and comprehensive homeless services departments. Under her leadership, LA Family Housing has transformed into one of the region's largest homeless service providers and a premier developer of environmentally sustainable and affordable housing in Southern California. She earned a master's in urban planning from UCLA, and she currently sits on the Governor's Council of Regional Homelessness Advisors, the UCLA Affordable Housing Advisory Council, and U.S. Bank's Advisory Board. She also served for 4 years as an Affordable Housing Commissioner for the City of Los Angeles. Miguel Santana has over 30 years of experience leading numerous fiscal, legislative, political, and community issues. He was the City Administrative Officer for the City of Los Angeles from 2009 to 2017, where he oversaw the city's $9 billion budget and designed the city's first comprehensive homeless strategy. Prior to that, he served for 2 years as Deputy Chief Executive Officer for LA County, overseeing all social service programs supporting children, families, veterans, and persons experiencing homelessness. He currently serves as the president and CEO of the Weingart Foundation, which is a private grant-making foundation advancing racial, social, and economic justice in Southern California. So we're going to start by hearing from Travis Stanley, and then Anna, Heidi, Stephanie, and Miguel will have a roundtable discussion and then take audience questions. And then I'd like to invite you all for some coffee, tea, and cookies that we'll have out in the lobby, and we can all talk about these issues some more. So without further ado, let's first hear from Travis Stanley. He's a formerly homeless military veteran who recently moved into a building in Sylmar that was funded through Prop HHH, which is one of the measures that we'll talk about tonight. He talks about his background and what it finally means to be housed in this 4-minute interview conducted by our moderator, Anna Scott.
Originally, I'm from El Paso, Texas. My father's Irish, my mother's Mexican. I have one older sister. We really don't speak too much anymore because of my orientation, which is fine, perfectly fine. I still love my family regardless if they ever want to re-enter my life. They're more than welcome to. I served in the United States Navy as a storekeeper. I served between 1987 and 1994. I'm a Cold War veteran, a Desert Storm veteran, and Somalia. A storekeeper is basically what it sounds like. We bring in ship supplies, toilet paper, fuel oil, everything that the ship needs to operate. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I did not realize what it actually meant. I could not understand why I was not sleeping too well, why I would jump at the drop of a dime, why I could not have a stable relationship with anybody.
And the PTSD was connected to experiences you had?
My first C command, I was raped by a first-class storekeeper. I never spoke about it until recently. The fear was, at that time, being gay and serving in the military was a complete ban. So therefore, if I came out to anybody, I could have been court-martialed and sentenced to over 20 years of hard labor. So therefore, the fear was that if I mentioned anything about being raped to anybody, that they would discover I was gay. So therefore, I just bottled it up, stuffed it deep inside of me, hence the PTSD and the not being able to hold stable relationships. Professionally, I've held positions as a HR manager, director, and VP of personnel. So somewhat educated. I have a doctoral degree in forensic science. Got married. In that marriage, I did experience some domestic violence, which forced me to become homeless at that time. Because of that, also that trauma, I also experienced what's called a traumatic brain injury. The person would habitually hit me in the head. Because of that head trauma, now I experience chronic migraines. I wear these beautiful sunglasses because I'm very photophobic. And my memory is very disheveled.
Well, here you are in permanent supportive housing.
Yes, I was told about this specific property by a fellow veteran. I came out here, and typically because of my PTSD and my anxiety, my major depression, everything, I'm always on high alert. The lift dropped me off over here. I walked on property, and all that pressure went away. It just went away. It was still under construction, and so forth. And there were some construction delays. But it was well worth it, because today, myself and Kenzo, my German Shepherd, she and I have such a great life here. We're able to sleep at peace every night, which is very important for me. Me and not sleeping is very bad for me. That's the beautiful thing of being in supportive housing, is that it does support the individual, not just the veterans, but individuals as a whole.
What are the things that you do for fun?
Well, that is a very good question. Damn, I wasn't prepared for that one. I like to draw. I'm not an artist. I freely admit that I'm not an artist, but I do love to draw. I have what I entitled an art journal. And whenever I have something that's really pressing in my head or I'm starting to fix it, I draw it out.
welcome. I'm Anna. Thanks for coming, everybody. So we opened with that interview with Travis because my hope is that this can be a somewhat positive conversation, not just a complete downer. As Claudia said before, Travis lives in a building that was funded partly by Proposition HHH, which is one of the two measures that we'll focus on for tonight's discussion. It was passed by voters in 2016 to fund new permanent supportive housing, like the building that he lives in. The other measure that we'll focus on is Measure H. That was the quarter-cent sales tax increase that was passed the next year in 2017, countywide, to fund homeless services. So I think from my own reporting that there's a lot of questions about the measures. People see homelessness numbers going up, and certainly ask me all the time, well, what happened to all this spending? You know, where is all this money going? Is it just being wasted? Is it grift? What's happening? So we're gonna really get into that and unpack it. But I will say right at the top that that the money, it is being used, and so there is good news in tonight's program. But we're really gonna get into the nitty gritty of exactly what it's being used on and why you're not seeing a huge difference on the streets at this point in time. So first, with all of that said, I want to rewind and clarify just what these measures were all about in the first place. And Miguel, I want to start with you. We're talking about Prop Triple H. So this is the homeless housing bond. So you were city manager. You, for a couple of years, were on the Citizens Oversight Committee for Proposition Triple H. So can you just explain exactly how this was going to work? The big headline was 10,000 new units of permanent supportive housing over 10 years. But can you explain what that means, kind of break down how it works? And as you're answering that, do you think that it was in some ways oversold to voters a little bit as a solution to the crisis in order to get it passed?
Well, let me start by thanking the Hammer Museum and you, Anna, for hosting this important conversation. I think everyone here would agree there's no bigger issue that we're facing. I was a city administrative officer for 8 years, and during that time, the city decided to finally get serious about solving this issue. And so, under the leadership of the mayor and the city council, I worked with my counterpart at the County of Los Angeles to develop for the first time a comprehensive strategy around homelessness. It identified many solutions and took the best thinking at that time. And the reason why it was important to do that with the county is that homelessness is an issue that is frankly itself homeless. It is, there's not one entity in any form of government that is 100% responsible to respond to this issue. And Triple H is a perfect example of that. Triple H is a citywide bond measure. What it means is that those dollars that are generated are specifically for the purpose of building housing, bricks and mortar. You can't use any of those dollars for services. They're 100% limited to build stuff. And the way the city traditionally builds affordable housing is in partnership with nonprofit providers like LA Family Housing and many others. Where
I have a question for Stephanie that's related to this. So,
traditionally, the city had very limited resources for housing. So in order to maximize its investment, it required that affordable housing developers leverage every dollar that was submitted. And those dollars come from the federal government, they come from tax breaks, they come from the state, from philanthropy. When you aggregate all of those dollars and a lot of sweat capital from folks like Stephanie, you're able to build affordable housing. So Triple H was designed under that idea that using the idea of leveraging, we would get to 10,000 units within 10 years.
And I have a follow-up question for Stephanie, but I do want to clarify a wonky thing about this measure, which is when you first hear it, 10,000 units over 10 years, it sounds like this enormous thing that's going to make this very visible dent in homelessness. But when you actually think about it, I mean, there's 40,000 plus unhoused people just in the city of Los Angeles alone. Even if all of that had been built in year one, it was never going to solve the crisis. And then when you looked at the math of it, this is just for the audience's understanding, it was the city was already building a few hundred, or contributing to a few hundred units of permanent supportive housing each year. So over 10 years, that was a few thousand units. So technically, this was going to help facilitate the construction of an extra 7,000 units over a decade. So we're now, and I think in their minds, people think, okay, 10,000 units over 10 years, so that means 1,000 units a year. But we're only now, 7 years later, kind of in this peak of seeing the fruits of this measure, with thousands of units finally opening this year and next, and which is exciting, but it has taken a very long time to get here, and we've all heard a lot of headlines about how expensive some of the projects are. And so, Stephanie, my question to you is, can you explain, as a developer, how you actually have to fund projects and what it takes to build these, and how Triple H fits into that picture? Because I think that's not well understood either. The city's not just paying for this whole project. Can you demystify that?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for including LA Family Housing. Travis, who you met earlier, is living at Summit View Apartments, which is a development that LA Family Housing recently opened. 50 units of permanent supportive housing for veterans who had been chronically homeless. So we're thrilled that Travis and his beautiful shepherd have a home there, and we welcome anybody to come and visit it. One of the things that I always say is you really can't appreciate what permanent supportive housing provides for its tenants, what all affordable housing provides for their tenants, until you come and visit. And so I always welcome people. Please call and ask to go and visit. Don't just drop in, because it is somebody's home. But it is Travis's home and 49 other residents. So we're really proud of Summit View and all the others that have been built. To just directly answer your first question to Miguel, Triple H has been a success. We will achieve 10,000 units developed in the time frame that was promised. So we're building what was promised in the schedule that was promised. But what you said, Anna, is also true. And that is, our messaging when we ran the campaign for Triple H is still true today: homes end homelessness. But it doesn't mean that Triple H was going to end homelessness alone. That funding represents about 20% of any deal. As we're a nonprofit organization that is both a large regional homeless service provider and an affordable housing, supportive housing developer. Whenever we build a new building, we have to go out and secure about 4 to 5 sources of financing. The city comes first, then we apply to the county, then we apply to the state, then we apply for a federal source of funding called federal low-income housing tax credits, and then we kind of squeeze in another little conventional piece. Triple H was the first piece of that puzzle. But to secure 5 sources of financing, you can't apply at the same time. You can't apply to the county till you have the city. You can't apply to the state till you have the city and the county. You can't apply for credit, right? So that's what takes so long, is layering multiple sources of financing. That is a puzzle. You miss one round, you lose a whole year before you can apply for anything else. So I think, that's sort of complicated and a headache and hard to put on a campaign slogan. Triple H, give us 20% of what it will take to build housing. That doesn't really work. Homes do end homelessness, and I believe that at my core. And I do believe one of the things that we learned from Triple H, and there were a lot of great lessons learned. It wasn't the first time we were layering financing, but there were a couple really key things learned, and that is we can develop more housing at a lower cost and faster if we reduce the amount of sources to this puzzle. If Triple H was able to put in maybe a larger percentage into each deal, then we might have reduced the number of sources by 1 or 2. And that could have saved easily a year or 2 years on each of these. The good news is we projected 10 years because we knew how long it would take. And we will hit the 10,000 by 2026. LA Family Housing alone, I have to look at my notes because it's been somewhat astounding. As Anna said, LA Family Housing used to develop about 1 new building every 3 years. Since Triple H funds were infused into the city of LA, we're now breaking ground on 3 buildings a year and opening the doors on 3 other buildings a year. We have 750 units of housing in about 10 buildings that will be opening up over the next 2 years, thanks to Triple H. So it has made a huge impact and has been a success. We just need more resources like it.
Well, and I have a question that I want to get back to you on, Miguel, but I want to get Heidi into the conversation and also get this county measure H into the conversation too, because in some ways I think it is sort of this companion measure to Triple H. So as Miguel was talking about at the top, there isn't one agency that takes care of homelessness. Everything's very siloed. So there was the bond measure that was just for brick and mortar construction of housing, and then there was this county-wide measure H that was supposed to go to services, and some of that means social services and supports in some of these buildings, so on-site case managers, things like that. But Heidi, can you take us a little more into the world of what does homeless services really mean, and maybe just using Housing for Health as an example?
Sure. Yeah, and I want to say thank you to everyone in this audience who pays taxes, because it helps us deliver services to people who are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness. And just to tag on to what Stephanie said, housing does solve houselessness, but the traumas of having been homeless don't necessarily end when someone gets into an apartment. And we have to address the things that happened to the person while they were street homeless, their experience in interim housing, the experience of being disenfranchised fiscally and socially. And that's where the service package comes in, right? And from the moment we touch someone in the street, someone who's struggled, who's fallen out of housing, to accompanying them through the really hard world of navigating interim housing and dealing with shelters and everything that brings, to moving them into a unit like Travis, there needs to be what we call an accompagnateur, someone who knows, who can help that person navigate the system, but also pay attention to them and listen to their story, validate their experiences, make sure that they're accessing the services that they need to, once they get into housing, remain there and be successful. And what Housing for Health does, we're just one of many players in this field. And I think it's really important to understand that it does take a village. It's you who are constituents, and I hope we can talk about like what is the role of all of us here in terms of building this notion of a civil society, right, in tackling homelessness. It's the funding, it's all the measures we pass, it's the people that we hire to walk with people who've experienced homelessness, who are experiencing homelessness. But what we deal with at Housing for Health specifically is that fraction of people experiencing homelessness, which I think you've talked about in your other series. There are different types of people who are experiencing homelessness. You don't get to homelessness through one path. We at Housing for Health with DHS are specifically focused on people who are marginalized because of their physical health or mental health, addiction issues, long histories of trauma. So there's that distillate of vulnerability. And like Travis, who'd been through so much in his life, you can't just say, here's an apartment, see you later, right? We have to be there to provide those services on an ongoing basis to help him thrive. We talk about Housing for Health as how do we help someone thrive, not just survive in housing? And some of it is sort of undoing past traumas, but also helping build skills resilience, but also capitalizing on people's strengths. I'm always amazed at what people bring and what they've survived and how we can use that to create the future story. And what I love to see is when you see people that we've served, like Travis, turning into service providers themselves, because that's a beautiful arc. And so what Measure H has allowed us to do is build in that service provision to fund the street outreach worker, to fund the case manager in the shelter, to fund the case manager who goes and knocks on Travis's door and say, hey, you know, I saw you were really upset. What's going on? Let's talk about it. What do you need? You know, who funds the specialty clinics who help people like Travis get the services that they need. Our benefits program to help someone like Travis who maybe doesn't have income, get income so he can afford his rent. All of those pieces we have to provide, and that's what Measure H allows us to do.
And I think one thing that maybe is important for understanding these measures, well, and particularly Prop Triple H, is the kind of housing that it's helping to fund is very specific housing for generally people who have experienced chronic homelessness and also have a physical or mental disability and really live in not only subsidized rent, but also permanent or also case management and services on site, which is just a sliver of people experiencing homelessness in LA County, but can be very difficult to find housing for and supportive services for. So, but we were talking before the panel started backstage about how actually the biggest way out of homelessness in LA for people experiencing it is self-resolution. Most people who fall into homelessness in LA are able to get out of it on their own, and then there's different subsets of people that end up experiencing it for a long time, but this is just one particular sliver that does need a lot of support. So that's what we're talking about. But Stephanie, I have a question for you, and then I have a question for Miguel that I think will dovetail with this. But in addition to the time that it's taken to get here with Prop Triple H, we've also heard a lot about the cost of the projects, that they're expensive, some $600 and something thousand a unit on average. So can you explain why that is? Can you put that into context?
Sure, of course. It's expensive to build, period. Whether you're building a market rate unit, whether you're building a supportive housing unit.
And are these units more expensive than a market rate or not? They are.
Yes, they are more expensive, but they're more expensive because remember the 4 or 5 different sources I talked about? Each one of those public agencies and their partners, each one of those public partners, city, county, state, federal government, have other social policy goals that they are trying to achieve in addition to building the housing. Living wage rates. We have to pay prevailing wage on all of our construction of affordable and supportive housing. Supportive services, green design, sustainable design goals, whether it's the drought-tolerant landscaping or the solar panels on the roof. So prevailing wage and sustainable green design alone is a 30% markup on the cost to build the housing. That is straight off the bat. So we pay market rate to acquire a site to build on. We pay prevailing wage for the construction. Then there are these soft costs. Those are just regular hard costs, construction costs and acquisition. That's we can't get around those. Those wage rates are set by the state and by the state. Wage rates are set by the state, right? Yes. We can't get around those. And as I said, that's about a 30% markup. But then on top of that, our public partners are investing in our project. Sure, we might own it, but they are our partners and this is a long-term investment they've made. And they want to protect that investment and ensure that we have the resources should something happen. We capitalize reserves. So we have to put in a reserve from the day the door opens. We've got a reserve should the roof cave in 10 years. That's an expense to capitalize reserves, but it's protecting an asset and an investment, so it makes sense. However, it could be that we structure the financing different in the future, where we reduce the number of sources that we have to go after. And in so doing, we reduce the time it takes to build this housing. We reduce the amount of money it costs to apply for, to have lawyers review all the different funding applications and contracts that we have with the different funding sources. And it could conceivably reduce the size of our reserves. And we build up those reserves instead over operations. So LA Family Housing launched a private equity initiative 2 years ago when we had the opportunity with our Project Home Key sites. And we went out and we sole sourced the financing. We leveraged private capital so that we could cut down our funding to 1 to 2 sources instead of 4 to 5. And in so doing, we could shave off 2 years that it took to build every building and almost $4 million to build every building. So we're hoping that we're able to shift the financing structure a bit, still use public money and leverage it with private capital, but shift the number of sources so that we can produce more units at a lower cost and a faster rate.
Well, Miguel, this is a question I have for you because this way that affordable housing gets built now, relying on private developers like LA Family Housing, who have to go and spend years cobbling together all these financing sources, and it is very convoluted, not very efficient by its nature. And I know one of the criticisms that you have had of Prop Triple H is that rather than just plugging the dollars into this status quo system, that maybe the city could have been more innovative in thinking about how to use that money. So could you talk about that?
Well, I want to validate something that Stephanie said, is that Triple H is delivering what it promised. The missed opportunity, I think, that we had with Triple H is that we didn't establish a new model that places Travis at the center of it. You know, it was designed around a scarcity mindset, because when the city was, you know, every year struggling to invest in affordable housing, it needed leveraging. And I think, you know, where we are as a community in trying to solve the problem, we know about half of what we need to know to end homelessness. There's still a lot more we have to learn. And I think if we established a system that placed Travis and the other 70,000 people who are unhoused at the center, and created an expectation that being homeless is a temporary, episodic situation, and that every person should have a right to housing, then our system of government will be designed in a very different way. And so, you know, Triple H will complete its responsibility as been laid out, but we know that the need continues. And so what I'm hoping is that we reimagine how this system is done and not limit ourselves to how we've been doing things for so long. A good example of that is this idea of social housing. In many parts of the world, it's actually very common to have housing that is built and maintained in partnership with the private sector and the nonprofit sector to build housing in a much faster and cheaper way. And it's not just for those who are unhoused, but frankly, it's for folks like my children who are, you know, young women, you know, launching their careers, who are struggling themselves to find housing in Southern California and the West Coast. And so I think that the opportunity we have is to really design something that really responds to the enormity of the crisis, acts with a tremendous more urgency, doesn't create an expectation that, well, it is what it is and we just have to live with it and expect people to wait for housing to be built 5-6 years in, and really reimagine it altogether.
And are there any other examples? And correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, it seemed like you took a note, so maybe you have something to say on that, which so feel free. But I don't know. Are there other examples out there? You mentioned social housing, but like, what are more innovative models? Because even reporting on this, I've struggled to find them. You know, people talk about modular housing a lot, but the examples of it that I've seen in LA don't seem to save that much money, and or most of what they do save is the labor costs, not paying prevailing wage, or manufacturing things elsewhere, like Stephanie was talking about. And it doesn't. I don't know. I haven't. What would they be? What would the more innovative?
Well, I think
housing models
Stephanie's used an example that she's doing and we're investing in, and that's not relying on government subsidy or relying on very little. When you think about how Los Angeles was developed in the turn of the last century, the San Fernando Valley would have never been built if it was built today, because our system isn't designed to build. Our system is designed to actually slow down building. And there are many ways in which that happens. From politically, a council member doesn't return a call and suddenly the rest of the system doesn't respond, to from a land use perspective, from a construction perspective. It's all designed not for speed. It's designed to take care of other interests and not the interests of the people who are unhoused or those who need affordable housing. But there is an emerging model of private, nonprofit, and for-profit developers who are saying, it's not worth it to accept Triple H and other funding streams that are subsidized. If we get private investment or philanthropy, our foundation invests in these opportunities, not from our philanthropy dollars, from our corpus, from our endowment, where we expect a rate of return. By reducing the number of sources, as Stephanie said, the costs are actually cut to 1/3. And if we allow for a streamlining of development by minimizing all the ways that a developer has to do a mother may I, to build with a sense of urgency, then I think we have an opportunity to reimagine what that looks like. And so we know what those barriers are. We know why it costs so much. We know why it takes so long. And so tackling each one and not simply accepting that those are the barriers, I think is what's critical.
I want to add a barrier. I want to add a barrier. So you mentioned the San Fernando Valley. I'm an OG Valley girl. I was born and raised, and I still live in the Valley. Yay, 818. Two of my kids have tattoos that say 818, so I raise like really proud Valley people. It's kind of crazy. Anyway, density. Not a bad word. In the San Fernando Valley, we still have queue conditions. It's a qualifying condition where a property is, not only were we not built to or designed as a city to build housing, we were not designed to build high.
What is a queue condition?
Oh, a pain in my ass. A queue condition it just stands for a qualifying condition, and it could say anything. It could say, the Valley still has some agricultural zoning, so even in single-family home neighborhoods, but they still, if you are trying to build something else where that home stood, and you look up the zoning, it might be an A1, agricultural that allows for one house, with a queue condition that only allows for 5 chickens. I mean, it's a funny, it can be for anything. We bought a property where the queue condition restricted that all that could be built on that site, despite it being a C2, a commercial 2 that allows for multifamily apartment building to be built there, but the queue condition restricted them to seniors. Like, it's just something that the neighborhood said, we want on that site, or in other words, we don't want everything else on this site. It's just land use policy is as critical to look at as fiscal policy, because our land use policies are what are limiting the pace of and the scale of our developments. pretty much every site where we are building 2-story buildings, that's because we're restricted to 2-story. If we could build 75 units on the same lot where we're building 50 units right now, think of how much faster we would be addressing our housing crisis. But if you look at most affordable housing developers and you look at our pipelines, you see a lot of 49, 49, 49 unit buildings. And that's because we had a land use policy that said any supportive housing in the city of Los Angeles that was more than 49 units had to go out to the community for site plan approval. A market rate developer doesn't have to go back out to the community for site plan approval. What the building looks like, that's site plan approval. But because somebody decided, because of who is living in our buildings, not what our building looks like, but because of who our tenants will be, we're going to put further restrictions. That's land use policy. Yes, the permanent supportive housing ordinance has allowed it to change, but not to the level that it needed to yet. We'll still work on that. But these are just things that we need to work on. We need to imagine differently, as you said, Miguel. And I think to your question earlier, Heidi, what role do we all play in these changes coming about? I think that's really an important question to ask and something we can talk about more later.
Well, we can. I said this would be a very optimistic panel. But there are hopeful parts. And
Solvable problem.
yeah, well, Heidi, I have a Measure H question, and we've been talking a lot about building and Prop Triple H, but the countywide one, Measure H, was a sales tax increase. So I'm wondering, was the revenue from that affected by the pandemic? And I don't know, is that something that's felt by programs funded through it?
I think, but I'm going to have to check my math. I think 22-23 was about $475 million that came in through Measure H. So it's a lot of money, but when you think about providing supportive services for 7,000 unhoused people, as well as continue to provide support for the Travises that we've housed. So for instance, Housing for Health with Measure H, we've funded about 20,000 people, but if you look back over the past 5 years, I think Measure H has housed about 90,000 people. Those 90,000 people in permanent supportive housing are still getting services, right? Which is good and critical. So it doesn't end just when you place someone in housing. Those services need to continue. In terms of like impact, yes, it's going to rise up and down, and we have this horrific, heinous budgeting process where we say, this is the amount we have, how are we going to divide and conquer? And we think about what we can do, and it does, fluctuate, but not hopefully to the degree where it's impacting. One of my biggest things is around the fact, and I actually know that like the prevailing wage is an issue, but I think when we look at our service providers that are being funded by Measure H, they are not making a living wage. And that's a huge sustainability issue because the retention rate is low. And when you think about it as a system, it's highly inefficient because you put all this training and resources into creating a workforce that is doing service, but they can't pay their rent or health insurance. They get homeless. So it's actually costing more. So I think there's a lot that we need to do, but the issue is there's not enough dollars. And I think that's a big issue because people are like, oh, we're throwing $400 million at it. But you're like, this is probably an $8 billion problem when you read like what this actually would take. And I think for me, the only other thing that I would add to this conversation is around the issue of living wage in terms of our collective work. And probably some of you have seen some of these data that have come out that in LA, a living wage is about $64,000 a year. And who of our staff that we hired to water our yards or, do our coat checks or whatever, like they're not pulling that. And so we're not turning the spigot off. No matter how much housing we build, there are people still entering that river. And we really need to look at that as well, because services are fantastic, but I'd love to sort of move upstream too and think about how people end up in that river to begin with. And I think that is something collectively we have to tackle.
Yeah, well, the $8 billion figure that you mentioned, I think that is a real number that comes from a report that that I've seen, that maybe from the state, about what it would cost to end homelessness in California, and that was a number that that they came up with. And so, which does get me to the scale of the crisis versus what any of these measures are able to accomplish. And I was wondering if you could give us a little more insight, actually, into some of the services funded through H, beyond just the services in buildings that also have funding from the other proposition. But what are some of those things? And because I know it can all feel very blurry to people. They just see a huge crisis on the street, and it's like,
well,
where's the
can
outreach?
do some, and Stephanie also as a service provider can speak to this. But I'll give you some stories. So. I was actually out with the mobile clinic van the other day, and we saw a 42-year-old guy who used to be a real estate agent. During COVID, actually, sort of like lost his work, but he also had an addiction issue, and fentanyl. And fentanyl is a huge issue, as you know. It doesn't impact just poor people; like, it's impacting a lot of different people. And he became homeless, and he was living in his car, and he had some untreated medical issues as well, heart failure. And because he was in his car and never able to elevate his legs, he developed horrific leg wounds and infection that kept landing him in the hospital. And he was so embarrassed by the odor of his legs, and kind of like where he had been and where he was now, that it was very difficult for him to seek care. And as you can imagine, a lot of us tend to sort of recoil from people without knowing their story, right? And where they come from. And when you talk to him, he talked about how difficult it was, 3 years ago to walk into an emergency room versus now, and what that's like. And so he wouldn't go and get care. And when our service members, so our outreach team workers, were working with him for a number of years. A lot of homeless service provider agencies are out there doing street outreach. They know these people really well. They go into the underpasses and the encampments, and they make relationships. And we just started a mobile clinic, street medicine, in September. And we just started doing his wound care in the car, because he wouldn't leave, because he was so embarrassed. And now his wounds are healed. He also was getting help from our psychiatrist and our social worker. We got him started on Suboxone to deal with his fentanyl issues. And he actually went into a tiny home, and now just got housed in Hollywood, right? And he's like back on his feet. And all of that is literally, and that's all service provider, right? Whether it was the peer outreach worker, the street outreach worker, the nurse, the psychiatrist, the housing navigator, the person at tiny homes who was making sure he had enough food to eat and his Medicaid was active, to the case manager who's now helping him stay housed and helping him look for work. And all of that, when you think about it, that's like 14, 15 people, right? But think about the reversal in his arc and his history, because otherwise he probably would be dead, right? That's always the cheaper solution for any system, unfortunately. But that's not what it means to be a civil society, right? Like, we take care of our own. We should, and it does take this level of care.
Well, yeah, I've definitely found in my experience reporting, and all of you can weigh in on this, that the number of people involved in a case like that, it is big, and it's very lucky when it all falls together for somebody, and they can make it through that whole spectrum. I've certainly seen the ball kind of get dropped with people who are handed from one person to another, and sometimes that can be a weakness, it seems like, in the system, that there's one person responsible for the physical health and one person who deals with mental health and one person deals with housing and somebody that does street outreach. And certainly I've seen communication break down there and people just languish on the streets. I guess my question is just, is there, I know the resources aren't there to do very intensive street outreach for every single person in LA, but are there ways to make that fabric better more of the time?
Yes.
I was going to add, in terms of how the Measure H dollars had an impact. Where did we see the greatest change in how we deliver services once our system was infused with Measure H funds? And I would say it's really in our street outreach. Measure H allowed us to shift our service delivery model to be very field-based. We no longer needed to wait for clients to come to us, but we were able to bring the care. We have what's called MD teams, multi-MDT teams. I guess it's redundant. Multidisciplinary teams, where we have a peer advocate, meaning somebody with lived experience, that goes out and does street outreach with someone with mental health support, recovery support, possibly a housing navigator, that's a case manager that's going to help you move in to permanent housing. And you could move straight from the street into a permanent home. We were able to put tablets in everybody's hands. We were able to do assessments in the field. Oh my gosh, when COVID hit, that was a whole other sort of layer of service that our MDT teams provided, because they became really health advocates and educators out in the field, delivering PPPs, no, PPE, PPP was the loan fund, delivering PPEs, helping to educate people how to stop the spread of the virus. Becoming a field-based system, I think, was a real game changer. I think we've been able to connect with more people. Field-based is not just how our outreach team workers service our participants who are unhoused still, but it's also our stabilization teams. It's the teams that go into apartments. Can I share one story? Miss Shalimar. I was shadowing one of our housing stabilizers, and she was doing a home visit to Miss Shalimar, who lived with her two late teens children in an apartment where she had been for about 4 years. This was just a routine home visit. Our staff person knocks on the door. Miss Shalimar, it's Monica. I'm here for you. I'm here with a friend, Stephanie. We come in. We open up her apartment. I don't come from a social work background. Everything to me was like red flags. I want to solve everything right away. But the brilliance of my case manager, she just probably took it all in and then addressed one thing at a time. When we walked into Miss Shalimar's apartment, she was down on the ground with hundreds of pieces of paper all around her. The house was dark in the middle of the day. I could see from one side, looking out to the patio, she had about 6 feet pile high of recyclables. On the kitchen table, there was another pile high of food, and all the pantry cabinets were open. Monica just says, Miss Shalimar, what's that one piece of paper by your left knee? And she picks it up, and sure enough, it's her eviction notice. And what we learn in about 10 minutes is the following. Miss Shalimar's car broke down, and she didn't have the $750 she needed to repair her car. She was dependent on her car to take in the recycling. The recycling income is what she used to pay her electricity bill. Her car breaking down, she couldn't take in the recycling, which meant her electricity got turned off. Maybe one decision that wasn't great in her story was she thought, oh my gosh, the electricity's off, I better empty the fridge. And she took everything out of the fridge and put it on the table. That, of course, brought in little critters. And as any of us who have rented apartments knows, critters in your place means they're probably in your neighbor's place and vice versa. So the neighbors called the landlord and said, I've got critters. The landlord came in and saw what was going on in Miss Shalimar's and served her with a 3-day notice for $750. So Measure H not only provided resources to provide that kind of cash assistance, to get the utilities back on, to get her car repaired, to clean her apartment, but more importantly, or equally important, was the staff to be able to check in and be field-based, to know what's going on once somebody moves into permanent housing. They need to know that they can remain stable and successful, and the resources that we've provided in the county have allowed us to do that.
Well, I want to go to audience questions in just a couple of minutes, but I do want to ask a question that's related to future allocation of resources and future spending more than past measures. But it seems like right now in LA, we're at the beginning of, or maybe in the midst of, something of a policy shift with the new mayor and a new head of the LA Homeless Services Authority to really focus on cutting street homelessness, even if that just means getting people into temporary shelter. Now, I think any of these officials will say that they are also dedicated to addressing the root causes, and they realize that we need more affordable housing to really end the crisis, and they want to do that too. But we all know resources are finite, and there is this very deliberate shift to managing the program, ending street camping very deliberately. Again, even if it means not ending homelessness for every individual. So I wonder, how are you guys thinking about that? Do you think that's a good shift? Does it cause any concern that the pendulum could swing more towards, funding temporary measures at the expense of permanent supportive housing, things like that? What do you guys think? You want to start?
I actually find it refreshing, and the reason I find it refreshing is that the mayor is breaking this sort of this black and white thinking that you could only do one thing or the other. And I think the way she approaches it and what it is, she approaches it from the perspective of the person who's unhoused. And by providing a response to that individual and moving them into temporary housing modeled after Project Roomkey that came out during the pandemic, you're demonstrating a couple of things. The first is that there's a fallacy that people don't want to be housed. Most people, meaning like 99% of people, will say yes, I'm willing to go in, and that's why you see large encampments suddenly disappear throughout the city, and they're being placed into temporary housing. The challenge that she has is that there really isn't an efficient system to take someone from the street into housing quickly, for all the reasons that we just talked about, for how long it takes to create permanent supportive housing. And so in the process of acting with this sense of urgency, which I think is grounded in her strategy, she is exposing the gaps in the system and trying to streamline them. One of the issues that Stephanie raised around unique barriers that were placed specifically for permanent supportive housing that don't exist for market rate housing, those have been one by one eliminated, first through the emergency declaration, and now it's been codified through an actual ordinance at the city council. One barrier out of dozens that need to be responded to. And so what I appreciate about the mayor's approach is, number one, she is treating it like an emergency. She is not waiting for the perfect to start getting things done. And she's trying to respond to the issue at every stage of it. And I think it's not perfect at all, and it has a long way to go. But for me, as someone who's been working on this issue for most of my career, it is actually the most optimistic I've felt in a long time, because we're being honest about what's not working. We're not just accepting the challenges that exist and simply asking people to wait, and frankly, asking people who are housed to wait. And that tension that exists is a real tension. And so being able to find a balance, finding a way that's compassionate and persistent and not willing to take excuses, I think is something to applaud. But it does take all of us to ensure that that it just doesn't just end there, that it has to be built, it has to be operationalized, and it has to actually be something that outlives even this mayor. It has to be a new system that in fact deals with the problem on a permanent basis.
compassionate and persistent. That's my takeaway. 100%. I agree with what Miguel said. LA Family Housing has operationalized 3 inside safe encampment resolutions, and we're now operating the interim housing for the folks that moved off the streets. The urgency, the sense of action, there is nothing else that the mayor is speaking of now. And she is so singularly focused that I don't believe any of us could say we're not seeing a change. It doesn't mean people aren't still falling into homelessness. Prevention is the next big step and investment that I know that she's looking to make. But to really see the concentrated and coordinated effort between the city and the county alike in implementing Inside Safe has been great. One of the things we always say about homelessness is this is a crisis that responds to resources. We see a difference when we apply resources to solutions. Inside Safe is providing the interim housing resource, much like we saw at the beginning of COVID. As soon as we master leased all those hotels and motels, shocking, we were able to move people off the streets. They wanted to go inside. They just didn't have places to go before. Inside Safe is revisiting that with kind of a new, fresh urgency that we're excited to be a partner with the mayor's office and with LAHSA in implementing this.
Yeah, I would say I concur. I think from a clinician perspective, my biggest thing is the throughput and what happens to people who can't thrive in an interim housing setting and need more of that supportive services. And I think one of their challenges is going to be, and she is sort of building the plane as she flies it. And again, it's not just going to be city. It has to be city, community-based organizations, county, everyone has to participate in this. But it's like, how do we prioritize who gets placed into the right type of housing at the right time? We don't have a solution for that. And I think there are also a lot of vulnerable people who are in interim housing that also need throughput to permanent supportive housing. So how do you compare the guy that you just got off the freeway to the person who's been languishing in an interim housing spot for a long time? And then how do you make sure that people are getting the services that they need to thrive in whatever housing environment? Those are problems that we also have to deal with. But I think we're really excited about this energy. I was talking to my team the other day. We feel an optimism that we haven't in a long time, and that's really great. We need that because this can feel crushing, and I think for the first time, just being able to sole source something, which we don't have to vet it to 27 different people, being able to do special types of hires or get expedited contracts through, all of this bureaucratic stuff that we're getting rid of with the emergency authorization helps us move things forward, and we just need more of it.
Well, I want to turn it over to audience questions. I will say, as the skeptical reporter on the panel, a question that I have, just looking ahead, I wonder, and we'll be reporting on whether LA can do it all and, in any way, shape, or form, or whether we're starting in a direction that will eventually resemble something more like New York City, which has very few street encampments, but a huge and extremely expensive shelter system, and more unhoused people than Los Angeles does, which many will argue is a better system than what LA has. But I do wonder if we're going in that direction, or if we really can create that full spectrum of shelter, interim housing, and permanent housing. And I don't know, but we will see. I want to turn it over to questions that you guys have. Somebody else out there has a mic and sort of finds people and calls on them. So if you raise your hand and I'm not acknowledging you, that's why. But
yes, speaking of preventing people from falling into homelessness, there was an article in the LA Times this week, and I want to give kudos to the reporter, who I don't know the name of, who wrote this article. So apparently, after we closed the mental hospitals in California, there was set up a system of board and care facilities for the mentally ill in California. and they are closing by the dozens left and right because the money that they receive is insufficient in order to continue to operate. They're essentially trying to live on the SSI that these people get, which is totally insufficient. And it occurs to me that the people who must have fabulous skills to be able to operate a board and care facility for mentally ill adults, and to allow these places to close for lack of funding is just awful. So is there anything that Measure H can do to help these before they close, because it's going to be impossible to open them again, these board and care facilities?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit and defer to my colleagues too. So at Housing for Health, we have a portfolio called Enriched Residential Care, ERC. It's a type of permanent supportive housing that is specifically designed for people who have difficulties with their activities of daily living because of mental health issues or long-standing addiction that has led to, cognitive issues, dementia, repetitive traumatic brain injury. Lots of people who need this type of support in a board and care environment to thrive, right? You can't just expect, Monica, the ICMS, to knock every once in a while and make sure they're okay. They need to make sure they're getting their meals, that they're supported, that they're stimulated, all of that kind of thing. It is a huge issue because it takes a lot of money to run an ERC facility. And a lot of ERC facilities struggle with accepting our patient population because they are harder. They would much rather have the cute little old lady who knits everyone's scarves and makes empanadas on Saturdays rather than some of our clients who have long histories of trauma or may still have active mental health issues. It takes a special type of operator and more money than is being offered through the SSI rate, et cetera. So actually, we use Measure H dollars to pay additional dollar amounts to some facilities to take these individuals in the order sometimes of $2,500 to $5,000 a month on top of the SSI rate or the standard rate. We just don't have enough money to sustain and build enough of that type of housing. This is an issue that the state is aware of and is trying to pass legislation to figure out how can we increase the rate, the SSI rate, waivers, et cetera, to allow some of this. And how can we continue to leverage other types of dollars to provide the supportive services? Because right now, if you talk to some of our ERC operators, they'll tell you, I'm using that $5,000 a month that you're giving me to provide extra services to Susie to just keep the lights on, right? And so we have to keep making those investments, and it does cost, but at the end of the day, like you're saying, it is an obligation, and it makes sense to do. And a lot of systems, like healthcare systems, would be like, why is it on me? Why is it on me to support this? Is this a healthcare system issue? So, curious what other people have to say.
If I could add, this is a perfect example of what it looks like when we treat housing and healthcare as a commodity, as opposed to actually imagining a society where we find it unacceptable that we would literally shut down a place and largely a senior population throw out in the street. And so one of the things that, I'm a numbers cruncher. I was the chief administrative officer for the city. And the most compelling argument that I can make about why it makes sense to make these investments is because it's actually more expensive when we don't. Mm-hmm. So that individual or those dozens of individuals who will literally have no alternative now that they're in even in a very limited way, but still housed and receiving some levels of service, they will now become unhoused. And so they will become the frequent flyers in our emergency rooms, in our jail systems. They will have the impact in our neighborhoods, in our economy, as we're seeing in different parts of the city. And so, we've actually did studies, when I was at the county, we actually did an analysis. We took people who were housed, who were formerly housed and then were housed for a period of time, and ran them through the system and see how much did it cost before they were housed. And the amount it actually costs all of us as taxpayers to keep them unhoused was significantly greater than housing them. And so at some point, if the humanitarian argument isn't a strong one or a compelling one, from a financial perspective, it doesn't make sense that we establish a system where really it's by the grace of God and the limited resources that these boarding care providers have, that have done everything to stay alive and simply cannot, because the funding streams to support the most indigent of our community doesn't exist. It's not profitable to help the indigent. And so now they have to be in that place. And so there is an opportunity now that we know this to say, well, is this okay? Are we okay with this? We're at 70,000 unhoused people today. What does it look like 10 years from now? And at what point do we start saying, well, you know what, it's not okay. And it's not acceptable that we just allowed this to happen and insist on a different system moving forward.
I want to get some more questions. I know. You can weigh in on the next question, but I want to make sure we get some more in.
Hi, my name is Agatha. I'm a tenant organizer. And my question, first of all, thank you for this panel and a lot of knowledge, awareness, education. My question as an organizer in general is, after this, what could we all do individually? Is there an action all of us in this room can take? And I would love to have an answer from each one of you, so that we get out of this with more than education and awareness, but with really some action. Thank you.
I think Dr. Heidi would say you were a plant, because we were saying we need to leave with everyone taking action. So thank you so much for that question, and thank you for your organizing efforts. Our tenant organizers around Los Angeles have been instrumental in getting these measures passed, in advocating with our city council. That's what y'all can do. There is so much, we legislate a lot in Los Angeles and in California. We need bills passed to keep boarding cares open. We need organizers to have city council members approve new permanent supportive housing in their districts. We need people to take action and use your voices, because we are so dependent on these different legislation, is that the word? To do our work. All of us are doing work because it was funded by voters, approved by voters, I should say. That's what you really can do. Educate yourselves and then go out and educate 10 other people and invite them to neighborhood council meetings where the approval of a new permanent supportive housing is in your neighborhood is on the agenda that night, and support that development.
I mean, it starts by coming here and trying to understand this issue. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be angry that we've made investments and you don't see an outcome in your own neighborhood, and it's okay to channel that anger by insisting that we do better. And not just that somebody do better, but we do better. That includes everyone in this room. And housing. I'm when Triple H was introduced, and we put it on the ballot, it passed overwhelmingly. It required a 2/3 vote. It succeeded beyond what it was required. I had a theory if we had said, do you support a $1.2 billion housing bond for housing to be built within a mile of your home, would you say yes? And so I went all over the city talking to neighbors from Venice to South LA to the east side to the west side in the valley. And everyone said, yes, that housing makes sense, we need it, but we have too much in our neighborhood. There wasn't a single neighborhood that said, we'll love to have this housing in our neighborhood. Not a single one. But a super majority of Angelenos said yes. Now, we paid for a survey after the mayoral election, and we asked the question about whether you're willing to accept housing near you. And what has changed in the last several years is that most Angelenos, no matter where you live, feel proximate to this issue. Either they themselves feel housing insecure, they know someone close to them, like a child or a relative, who is housing insecure. But more than anything else, it's almost impossible to live in this community without experiencing homelessness in your daily life. From going to the supermarket to taking your kids to school, from going to work. It is part of being an Angeleno, like palm trees and, sunshine most of the time. And so folks are saying, that's not the kind of community I want to live in. And there's a shift that's occurring slowly that yes, housing could be in my community. And it doesn't mean that you accept it as proposed, but you walk into that conversation with the idea, if the developer is open to these adjustments, a way of responding to unique issues in the community, we are prepared to say yes. And that's something everyone in this room can actually do.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and the first thing I would say is be mythbusters. There's a lot of incorrect narrative out there about, all these homeless people are coming from out of state because they have it good in California. That's not true. 90% of people experiencing homelessness that you walk by every day and you choose to engage with or not probably lived near that neighborhood and became homeless, right? This is a local problem. This is a we problem. Everyone who's homeless is mentally ill or an addict or dangerous. Not true, right? Small percentage that illness led them to homelessness. But think about what it's like to be chronically homeless. You can develop those as symptoms of your homelessness, and sure, we have to contend with it, but that's not the reality. The other myth is sort of around, why is this my problem? It is a collective problem, right? Because as you said, you're walking into it, you have to deal with it. And the question is, how do we create a space where we feel capable and confident to do something? And I think there are lots of ways where you can be a community organizer, you can show up at those town halls, you can have a voice with the people who saying, not in my backyard, or what about single family zoning, or the redlining that still continues. Like, you can be a part even in your local community, but also when it comes time in 2027 to vote yes on Measure H, please do. If we get it to half-cent tax, fabulous, right? We need more resources. I think the other thing I would say is be kind. The other day I was going into a coffee shop and there was a homeless woman, and I saw one of my daughter's friends' moms who sort of like took a step back and didn't want to approach me because I was near the homeless person because she was scared, right? And I took an opportunity to go and talk to the woman who just happened to be this lovely person who was wearing rainbow shoes and was talking about what a great day and would you buy me a cup of coffee, and was just sharing this story about how wonderful it was to wake up and watch the sunrise. And having this mom witness that encounter with a human being, maybe next time we can be a little kind. It doesn't have to mean that you're giving money, but that smile and that connection means a lot to that person. And I think we're trying to normalize. It is not people's fault that they're homeless. Housing is a human right. It shouldn't be a privilege, right? And when you talk about the pedagogy of the oppressed, our economy, our individualistic sort of meritocracy-based system has led to a large degree to this problem. And I'm sorry I'm going off on a soapbox. But like, you know, what is our responsibility in making that human connection to that human being who's struggling, right? And that is really important to me. And I think that the final thing I would just say is be hopeful and optimistic. Oftentimes this feels so overwhelming that we just want to bury our heads in the sand. This is solvable, but we all have to play a part of it. And I think leading with that sense of optimism and hope is something all of us can do, and I think is really critical.
I actually think that's a really good note to end this on. It's gotten a little late, but this is a small crowd, and we do have this reception that's in the courtyard right after. So if you guys have the energy and have more questions, I don't know. I don't know if everyone will be available, but I will be there. Probably some of our panelists. I don't want to speak for you, but we can continue the conversation there. But I think, yeah, I think that's a good note to wrap up for on the formal presentation. So thank you, everybody, so much.